All right, welcome and happy Valentine's Day from ROMchip, a journal of game histories, where game history lovers come together. So no matter where you're tuning in from, or if you're watching this as a recording on our YouTube channel, we're happy to have you here. I'm Lane Nooney. I'm a computer and video game historian in the Media Studies Department at NYU. I'm also one of the co-founders and managing editors of ROMchip, a journal of game histories, who is hosting today's talk. I lovingly shepherd this journal alongside my talented co-editors, Henry Lowood, Dave Parisi, Soraya Murray, Logan Brown. Give a shout out if you're in the chat. I know some of you are. So for those of you who are new to ROMchip, and we've got some new friends here today, I'm going to take a minute and explain who we are and what we stand for. So here's the deal. ROMchip is an open access, hybrid audience online venue for the publication of game history. What that means is that as a venue, we develop, solicit, edit, and publish work across a range of formats, from traditional peer-reviewed articles to interviews and oral histories to short essays, translations, dealing with everything from video games to board games, analog games, sports, and play. We are an open access journal, which means we have no paywall, no advertising, no logins, no predatory publishing model. You don't ever have to pay anything to read the scholarship in ROMchip, ever. That is our unending commitment. Our authors keep their copyrights. We are really trying to model a different kind of future for what research publishing can look like. And lastly, we refer to ourselves as hybrid audience, because we're trying to create a big tent around game history, a place where we can have rigorous historical engagement with as many people as possible who want to participate in that project. So part of our mission is also that we believe you shouldn't need a PhD to be able to write for, or interview for, or even just read ROMchip. And so these talks that we do, called ROMchip Presents, are an extension of that mission to bring historical work to you through the power of live streaming. This is our third talk in a weekly series we've been hosting as part of our fundraiser season. We've previously had Jesper Juhl talking about the Commodore 64 and Rachel Plotnick discussing the history of gamer energy drinks with us. You can find those videos on our YouTube channel. I'll put it in the chat when I'm done. Today, our talk is on the Mattel Intellivision with Braxton Soderman and Tom Boellstorff. And all of that leads up to our 12-hour Twitch fundraiser that we're going to have right here on Saturday, February 22nd, next Saturday, right? Put it in your calendar right now. And the reason we fundraise is because, nobody else is paying for this. So from the beginning, ROMchip has rejected the status quo of academic publishing, and that includes working with for-profit publishers. We believe that an ecosystem of small donors produces a healthier future for game history than the interests of for-profit publishers or the ever-growing austerity of university administrators. We believe committing to our readers and our authors is how we live up to our potential. So our goal on February 22nd is to raise at least $7,000, which helps us keep doing all this incredible work. We've got a whole day of content for you with folks like Jason Scott from the Internet Archive, game designers like Merritt Kay and Paolo Parasini, Phil Salvador from the Video Game History Foundation, speedrunner Tina Hacks, Holly Nielsen, Sharang Biswas, Patrick Lemieux on the modular synth, Colleen Macklin will be talking about the trans vibrator. We've even got the furry butt plug engineer QDot. It's going to be super stupid, and you're going to have a blast. And I'm going to lean in here real hard and say, it's Valentine's Day. Show us some love, right? You want to keep game history weird? You want to keep game history alive? Show us some love. At this moment, we are 36% toward our $7,000 goal with 8 days to go. Momentum matters a lot during the early days of a fundraiser. So the closer we get to that 7K goal, which is just our first goal, right? 7K is like keep the lights on money. The sooner we can unlock higher fundraising tiers, which makes it possible for us to do more cool stuff, mostly in the form of paying people to write. As a bonus, every person who donates right now gets our early donor perk. So you'll get your name on our donation website. You'll get a little ROMchip swag. You'll get a personal thank you. If you want to know more about our fundraising mission, how we're spending this money, or you just want to get to donating, you can, we'll dump it in the chat, donate.romchip.org. Okay. So with all that out of the way, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Tom Boellstorff and Braxton Soderman. who are the co-authors of the book they'll be discussing today, Intellivision: How a Video Game System Battled Atari and Almost Bankrupted Barbie. Tom Boellstorff is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, and author of The Gay Archipelago: A Coincidence of Desires and Coming of Age in Second Life. Braxton Soderman is associate professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Irvine, and the author of Against Flow: Video Games and the Flowing Subject. And I'm really excited by today's book because when I cracked it open, it was just so clear in the first couple pages that this was serious business. You could feel the respect for the subject matter, but also the sort of larger respect for the project of doing history and putting the Intellivision in a larger cultural, industrial, and technological context. So I've been so impressed by this book so far, and I'm really excited to be able to host Tom and Braxton here today. And the one last thing before I hand it over, we've got a special discount code from MIT Press today for 20% off this book. The code is READMIT20. We'll drop the link in the chat. This is a big one too. So advertised on the back, yeah, I've got it right here. 40 fun, fact-filled pages. So, get on this. You can get this for less than 13 cents a page if you use that discount code, MIT20. All right, that's the end of me. I'm going to get out of here. Braxton and Tom, welcome. I'm going to let you do your thing.
Thank you so much. I will get our talk loaded up here. Everyone see that fine? Can you see that, Braxton?
Yeah, I can see it. Thank you so much for having us.
So thank you so much for inviting us. We are so flattered and honored, and on Valentine's Day of all days. And it's such an honor and a thrill to be here. And I want to add, my voice and Braxton as well to support ROMchip and this endeavor. It's such a wonderful thing to do. And thank you so much for mentioning that discount code. But I'll also say at the end of this talk, there'll be a QR code. MIT has published our book under their Direct to Open program. So the entire book is also available free as a PDF. You don't get the physical object, but you can also access it as a free PDF. And open access is so important for this kind of scholarship or any scholarship. And so I really want to give a shout out to ROMchip for the work that they are doing, and also say our book is available open access. So this book, Intellivision, a labor of love that Braxton and I started 10-ish years ago when we had coffee together and realized we grew up playing Intellivision and no one had written a big book about it, is just appeared in last November. So as of this recording 2 months ago, basically. And it was a big project. Over many years, we met and interviewed over 150 people, which is way more than I'd ever done before for any of my research, even as an anthropologist. And these former programmers, managers, executives involved with Mattel Electronics and Intellivision were so kind. We got over, by our best estimate, maybe 20,000 pages of documents that we'll still be going through in years to come. And in addition to the interviews. And so this kind of near history method where we're studying something between basically 1977 and 1984, it was amazing because, intellectual property doesn't really apply in the same way. It's been 40 years, and people really want to talk about that time. But unlike studying something from 100 years ago, we were still able to meet and talk to so many of the people involved. And a research method we used that was very productive was to actually show people documents from back then that would sort of trigger memories and help them, reassemble memories of what had happened during that period. It was really wonderful. And the book has three main parts. I won't go into that now, but we look at the history of the Intellivision platform itself. And as a platform studies project, we're looking at the actual technology, at the chip, at the programming, But we also look at extensions to the platform, and also how the idea of becoming a video game designer sort of came into being during this period. And today, what we're going to do is give a little overview of the book. But it's a 400-page book, and we don't want to have this run for 4 hours today. So we will do that in brief. But we thought we would pick one sort of case study to focus in on and illustrate some of the broader points that we talk about in the book. So we're going to talk about the game Kool-Aid Man, which came out in 1983. And then, of course, we'll be happy to answer questions at the end. So Intellivision, there you can see a picture of the video game itself, of the console, if you don't know what it is, was sold between 1979 and 1984. And it was very much articulating around the idea of making television intelligent and video games intelligent, in particular in comparison to Atari, with its joystick and red button and really tight link to the arcades. You can see that the Intellivision controllers are actually based off of phones from the period, with the keypad and even the curly cord. And David Chandler, the engineer who played a big role in that, talked explicitly about that as a model. The image on the left is actually from a TV Guide article that was written about Intellivision programmers. And once again, you get this idea of intelligence and design and video game design in a period when video games were very new and were just moving into the home. This is the second generation of video games where for the first time you have consoles with cartridges, right? Unlike Pong or a Space Invaders at an arcade, you can have multiple cartridges for one game. And one way that Intellivision marked its intelligence that we'll talk about later is through realism. And this Mattel Electronics logo features this famous Running Man design that was actually created by the engineer Dave James, that once again shows a kind of figure of the human and a kind of realism that Mattel with Intellivision was really articulating to distinguish itself from its competitors. These hand controllers, as I mentioned, were very much a smart departure, so to speak, from joysticks, and helped mark this sort of movement of video games into the home. Not just the wood paneling design of the console, but these controllers made possible games that had gameplay that could take hours that you could never do in an arcade. And the plastic overlays slip over these controllers to sort of customize them for each game. And here you see 4 examples from early Intellivision games. And the main point here is to see how complex they are. You really need the instruction manual to understand what's going on, and also how it would repurpose the keypad. So, the keypad goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But if you look at that third overlay of Sea Battle, you have 1 aircraft carrier that you can create, but 2 battleships. You can have up to 3 destroyers. Those actually don't correspond to the keypad underneath it, right? It really is, transforming this keypad for each game. And that was another aspect of the interface that really marked Intellivision as intelligent in comparison to its competitors. So now I'll hand this over to Braxton to talk a little bit about what was under the hood of Intellivision.
Yeah, so in this book, we do a really extensive analysis of the different hardware points at various parts, but we're not going to talk much about it here. In general, Intellivision was a very sophisticated machine when it was released, especially when compared to the Atari VCS or the Atari 2600, which dominated the market at the time. But cartridges were 4 kilobytes in size, which was larger than the 2 kilobyte standard for Atari at the time. And in addition, Intellivision had an onboard operating system, which was called the exec, which was really about a little bit over 4 kilobytes of generic game code that was stored in the console itself that would be useful for any game cartridge, like helping with putting up background graphics, the title screen, handling low-level interactions with the hardware so programmers didn't have to deal with that, and helping to manipulate Intellivision's 8 different moving objects, which we know as sprites today. As you can see from this image, the Intellivision was kind of divided into 2 different systems. There was the game logic system, which had the CPU, which had the operating system, which had the cartridges, and then a graphics system, which had the standard television interface chip or the stick, and then a place to store various 8-bit graphics. And the stick was really important because it automated the display. So 60 times a second, the stick would actually take over and paint the display. So the programmers didn't have to worry about painting the screen like they did with the Atari. So it really helped with programming labor. But we're not going to talk a lot about this today, but we're happy to chat more about this in the QA. Next slide. Yeah, so as Tom already said, our book is really big. It's a multi-dimensional analysis of Intellivision that looks at its history, marketing, hardware, peripherals, software, games, social cultures of production. And there's a lot of different arguments. However, there were some key interventions we wanted to make, and we're going to touch on some of these briefly today. For example, the relationship between toys and video game history, because Mattel was a toy company famous for making Barbie and Hot Wheels. We discovered many interesting continuities between toys and Intellivision, which revealed that the arrival of video games from the perspective of the history of toys was not a massive rupture, but exhibited many continuities. We also discovered that Intellivision was not really a game system primarily in the eyes of the people making it, but it was an extendable system. They actually called it, when they marketed it first, a revolutionary network of video hardware and software, where video games aren't even mentioned. So our book really looks at the different extensions and peripherals that encompass this Intellivision system. We'll talk a bit about that. We also discovered that you can't really understand Intellivision without understanding its rivalry with Atari. Right? Everything had to do with Atari. It shaped Intellivision's game design, its marketing, its business practices, and really everything about the system. So we'll talk about that. The impact of marketing, we discovered, was massive. Mattel was a powerhouse in the marketing world. And this really influenced Intellivision's development. And we also talk about how marketing had a big impact on the history of video games as well. In terms of realism, we really think that Intellivision and its battle with Atari set the stage for realism becoming such a crucial category for thinking about video games, especially in terms of graphical advances and video games becoming more and more realistic over time. And Intellivision really started this trend. And then finally, we'll talk about computational affordances and strengths a little bit. Usually in video game platform studies, we think about the constraints around video games as being computational, but we had such a massive amount of documents that we were able to learn a lot about constraints that were operating on game design, like temporal constraints or licensing and promotion. Next slide.
So very briefly, Mattel, which we know as a toy company, was founded in 1944 by Ruth Handler, her husband Elliot, and Matt Mason. And Mattel is from Matt's name and Elliot's name, although he exited the company very early on. And this link to toys, as Braxton was saying, we found to be really crucial in the analysis, that often in game studies, there's a link to play, but not necessarily to toys themselves. And that is actually really valuable for thinking about the history of video games, we found. And that shaped Intellivision in many ways, but also Mattel, in many ways, their claim to fame when they got started 11 years in 1955, they were the first toy company to advertise on television, and they sort of bet the entire company. It was a lot of money back then, $500,000, for the very first toy commercials for their burp gun, and 1 million of them sold within a month. It was transformative, and it really transformed the toy industry because there really had not been television advertising before then. And marketing itself really moved to the center. And then Barbie, which was introduced in 1959 and was one of the most enduring still to this day, obviously toys from Mattel, also was predicated on this razor blade model where you would sell the Barbie doll almost at a loss And the money came from the accessories, from the clothes, the camper, the shoes, the things that you would sell to go along with it. And once again, as Braxton was saying, this idea of selling a system and then like cartridges or games that go with it was already there in Mattel in a certain way in terms of how they thought about toys. And that history has shaped the history of video games more broadly in ways that we want to argue need to be more recognized because it's very significant. So a key question for us was, why did Mattel, a toy company, decide to make a sophisticated video game system, which, as Braxton mentioned, they really, from the beginning, 1976, 1977, 1978, and throughout, really thought of it as a home computing and entertainment and interactive system in many ways. Why did this happen? And there's many reasons for this, but here I'll hand it off to Braxton to talk about some of them.
Yeah, we were really curious about this question. It didn't seem to make sense. Why would they do this? But when we started digging into Mattel's history, it made actually a lot of sense. From the very beginning, Mattel was known for combining toys with technology. From their very inception, they hired a huge research and development team with many engineers that were hired from the aerospace and military industries. They were known as this kind of upstart technology and toy company. In the 1970s, they also had a group of engineers and designers whose job it was to look for new, exciting consumer technologies that could be repurposed to create interesting toys. So as people started talking about dedicated TV games and Pong and so forth, it just seemed to make sense that they would move into this market. But we also noticed that from the very beginning, even conceptually, Mattel was working towards the idea of this razor blade model that was really conceptually aligned with the programmable game system and cartridges. For example, very early in its development, Mattel used what they called principles, and Ruth Handler described these as, if you develop a basic mechanism or a basic concept, you develop one or two, three items around this concept at the initial introduction, and then year after year, you add new products around the initial concept. So for example, you develop a little music box that you can put into the toy that allows the child to continuously crank and play music. Then you can put it into a clock, you can put it into a phone, you can put it into a guitar, right? So they're already operating as kind of proto-platforms, these mechanisms. Next slide. We see them as well in their famous talking dolls. Chatty Cathy, for example, you would pull a string in the back, and Chatty Cathy would say phrases to the person playing with her. And later on, they developed Charming Chatty, which was an iteration on the system where you could actually have interchangeable little tiny vinyl records to put into the back of Charming Chatty. And some of these were even games, right, where the records that you would put in to her back would allow for these randomized pull of the string that would be Charming Chatty's moves in the game. So you could actually play a game with this doll. Next slide. We see this iteration of actually these little vinyl records again and again in Talking Football. Talking Baseball was another instantiation. The Superstar Art Airplane, for example, also used these small interchangeable record to control the flight paths. And if you look at the patent, it talks about these being programmable planes at the time, right? So again, they were developing these small little mechanisms, right, that would allow you to manipulate the toys and then iterating on them again and again. Next slide. In 1971, they actually iterated on this idea with interchangeable records and discs with a much larger technological project called the Optagon, which was a part toy, part high-tech organ. The idea was from Elliot that you would create an organ that anybody can learn to play. And so these records would have pre-recorded actual real music on them, and you would sample it with your left hand in various different ways. And on your right hand, you could play with the normal keyboard. And so the different records would contain different genres of music that you could put in and switch the music. The Optigon was really a crucial technology that came before Intellivision because it was a large, technologically sophisticated project that required a large collaborative effort amongst many designers and engineers, and it sold at a price point that wasn't toy-based. It wasn't really cheap. It was like $250 to $400, right? So the point is that Intellivision in the early 70s had a lot of experience developing these larger technological projects. Even though the Optigon eventually failed and lost about $6 million or more and caused a lot of problems within the company, at least it gave them institutional history with developing these larger high-tech projects. Next slide. It's also interesting that in about 1975, late 1975 and 1976, when Pong is in bars and home Pong system that people could buy for home to play on their televisions was coming out, Intellivision already had the idea for a programmable game system that was using microprocessors that were coming out at the time and becoming very cheap as well. So they didn't develop Intellivision in response to Atari coming out, which came out in 1977, but in fact had this idea along beforehand. And you can see from this big memo from David James, who's one of the designers who were thinking about these things, that they had the idea for a programmable game system. They wanted to make a football game that would have 11 players on both sides and a referee, and they had lots of different ideas for games. And that was the first category. The second category they were thinking about developing was based on the most popular consumer electronics at the time, which were calculators, handheld calculators, which were becoming cheaper and cheaper and were all the rage, right, in the 1973, 74, 75. And so they, you can switch to slide. So perhaps because the Optigon was a failed project that lost them so much money and was a huge technological project, they were a little wary to get into a programmable game system and another big technological project right away. So instead they pivoted to build what became the handheld games, right, which were based on this calculator technology. And these fit the toy model more because portable plastic machines, right, that they used grids of LED lights, like 3x7 grids of LED lights, to create these simple obstacle avoidance games, theming them mostly in terms of sports like basketball, baseball, and football. And football was massively successful in 1977 and made them a ton of money, right? And so these handheld games, these small portable toy-like objects, made them so much money and opened up the doors for this larger project to create Intellivision. Next slide. But really, you know, as Tom talked about the razor blade model, I talked about some of these smaller vinyl disc objects that showed up in a bunch of different toys that they were developing. Mattel had a long tradition of thinking about you know, making toys where you could do these kind of limitless game or limitless possibilities, right? This was a toy vacuform, actually. I forget the exact date that it was released in the 1960s, which was allowed you to create your own toys in a certain sense. So conceptually, Mattel was really prepared to think about the programmable game system as another method of delivering different kinds of games, that they could have this you know, platform, and then they could iterate again and again and again these different kind of cartridges to bring different forms of games to the public. And so conceptually it matched what they were doing in the past. Next slide.
So this story that we were just been hearing and Braxton has been talking about, you really see this sort of emergence of Intellivision coming from Mattel. And Mattel Electronics, that phrase was originally just sort of a brand name put on the handhelds, but it eventually became a division inside of Mattel that for a few years got bigger than Mattel Toys. And the head of it, one of the heads of it, Richard Chang, was the head of the team that developed that Optigon Oregon and had worked on the Chatty Cathy dolls. He had a long history, his whole career working inside of Mattel. And the hand controllers that I showed you when I mentioned David Chandler, he was brought in from North American Aviation, where he had helped design the guidance system for the Minuteman missile, had no background, to sort of think about, in toys, to think about this new possibility of Intellivision and the relationship between them, and that sort of inside the company versus outside talent, so to speak, really shaped Intellivision's history. Because from the beginning, it was not just seen as a game console, it was going to possibly be a home computer that would externalize computing, was a way that they talked about this. Fred Held, who was an executive in Mattel, talked about this in an interview. And externalizing computing then meant bringing it home, away from the mainframe, right? And because this was such a new technology, to try and describe it to people, they explicitly used an analogy with stereos, where you would buy a turntable and then speakers. Later on, you might buy a cassette drive, to play cassette tapes, or a third and fourth speaker, and you would do extensions. And here you see some drawings by Ted Meyer, who was a designer at Mattel. And on the left, this is sort of how Intellivision was eventually in its later years designed, with the main console, but also extensions for voice, a computing module, and so on. On the right is a design that didn't work out, but you can explicitly see how they thought about it like a boombox, right? It looks like a stereo. And this logic of extension was crucial to Intellivision's history. There was a period of hyper extension where so many extensions were developed that we talk about in the book. And one factor that shaped the crash, which we talk about a lot in the book, we won't talk about that a lot today, but was overextension, which drained resources, but also caused a loss of focus to some degree in the company when they were trying to develop new extensions at the same time as they were developing new games. So from the very beginning, when Intellivision got started, it was supposed to be two things. What we call Intellivision was called the master component, and it was to sit inside of something called the keyboard component that you see right here. And it was a real debate during that time about, was home computing going to lead to home gaming or the other way around? And Intellivision and Mattel Electronics, through Intellivision, was thinking that it would come through video gaming, right? Using this analogy to stereos. And this was a great example of overextension, because the keyboard component was never successfully released. It was test marketed. A few hundred were sold, but it was so, in some ways, ahead of its time that they were unable to successfully bring it to market. And we have a whole chapter in the book talking about that. Another main theme that we talk about now is this issue of the rivalry with Atari. We developed this concept of trans-platform in the book because for platform studies, there is value in focusing on a platform, right? On a single platform and looking at, let's say, Intellivision. But for any platform, and certainly including Intellivision, you can't understand it without the kind of ecosystem in which it was placed. And when you hear about console wars and Sega versus Nintendo, that's, whatever you say, new news. The original one was Intellivision versus Atari. And as you saw from that memo that we showed by Dave James, who also did the Running Man graphic, right? The idea for a home video game system was internally developed by Mattel prior to the release of the Atari 2600. But Atari beat them to market, got a bigger share of the market. It was about $100 cheaper than Intellivision in late 1970s dollars. And so it always had about 70% of the market, give or take Atari. And so in many ways, so many things about Intellivision, game design, console design, everything, was built around this comparison with Atari, this rivalry, but it was a rivalry in which they were the underdog. And here you see an image from an internal marketing document where even by 1982, this is a bit later on, they're talking about the positioning of Intellivision that is getting seen as higher priced, good graphics, more about sports, and sort of for older folks that, teenagers or even adults might play it. And this kind of relational thinking about Intellivision was fundamental to the system. And many people know about that nowadays due to the pioneering work in comparison advertising that Intellivision did, where George Plimpton, who was a famous personality at the time, who wrote sports journalism and books like Paper Lion, where he would, he would box and write about it, or he would play on a football team, was brought in as the spokesperson for Intellivision after a first attempt at commercials that didn't go so well. And it transformed the whole company and Intellivision. They sold out all their stock. It was a huge success, this rivalry campaign, although Josh Denham, who was president of Mattel Electronics at the time, talked to us about how it was seen as very risky because you were giving airtime to your competitor. But because they were in second place, they felt they wanted to piggyback off of Atari to show how they were better. And so it shows up in so many ways. The top left image there is an early Intellivision game that was never made because Atari said, we're going to sue you because it's too much like Asteroids. On the right, next to it, is Space Hawk, which was programmed by Bill Fisher, who talked to us about how he was told, make asteroids that's not asteroids, and actually do things that you can't do on the Atari to sort of show what we can do on Intellivision, right? And the two images on the bottom, they just went black now because they played through. But this one on the left was M Network Games, where they developed games for the Atari 2600 to show off, what you could do with Atari. And then that last one, towards the end, they did something called the System Changer that was actually an Atari 2600 reverse engineered that you would plug into Intellivision to be able to play plug into the Intellivision to be able to play Atari games on an Intellivision. And it was an actual Atari 2600 console reverse engineered with an Intellivision logo on it. So it actually penetrated the system, so to speak, in both directions. This rivalry, it penetrated both systems and really transformed them. So now we'll move on to a little more on marketing, and I'll pass it back to Braxton.
Yeah, so in our book, we really wanted to focus on marketing because we discovered that going back to the 1950s and 60s, Mattel was known as a giant innovating toy company in terms of marketing, as Tom already talked about, revolutionizing selling toys on television in the 1950s and 60s, right? And marketing had a huge presence in toy development and video game development. In fact, marketers before toys were made or video games were made would do studies to forecast trends and do market research about what types of toys or games were needed. And then they direct the design or programming departments about, the kind of games that they would need, like make us 4 space games, or we need more and more games with arcade action, et cetera. So marketing had a lot of power within determining what kind of games were made. Their marketing research at Mattel was super massive as well. And this kind of goes back to innovations that Ruth Handler made in the toy company. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But because of Mattel's background in marketing, they were the leaders in market research. They exported talent to all sorts of companies. Derek Gable, who was a toy designer, worked in preliminary design, said there was no second, right? And Mattel advertised this. Like, this is a brochure from 1979 before Intellivision was even out nationally, and they're saying massive advertising and promotion support. They wanted people to know that that television was going to be supported by the history that Mattel had with marketing. Yeah, and in television, they produced hundreds of marketing research tests, comparing Atari customer satisfaction to Intellivision, analyses of the hand controllers, various video games, the commercials that they ran on TV. And so it really was pervasive throughout the company. Next slide. Yeah, we already saw a little bit about Plimpton, who was hired to be the spokesperson for Intellivision. This comparison advertisement really revolutionized the history of video games. When they compared Intellivision to Atari on TV, it began the history of the console wars that we're very familiar with, such as Nintendo versus Sega or PlayStation versus Xbox, etc. It was also really crucial for establishing, as I'll talk about in a moment, the importance of video game graphics and the idea of realism and realistic graphics in video games, educating the consumer about how to make decisions about which graphics were better and so forth. And Plimpton also became this masculine father, grandfather figure who is a intellectual figure, but also athletic, right? So he combined these different signifiers of intelligence and athleticism, sophistication, and playboy bachelalism. So their marketing also had a profound effect on establishing video games as a boy toy or a masculine domain. So next slide. Yeah, and this was codified within the history of Mattel toys as well, where obviously toys have a long history of being gendered, and Mattel was really no different. In fact, they had gender divisions within the company, like the dolls division and the wings and wheels division, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. But since Mattel was also a pioneer of understanding play patterns for girls and seeking to profit from their passions and pleasures, they were also interested in attempting crossovers, like coming up with ideas for girls' Hot Wheels. You see a memo from, I think, 1975, trying to toy around with the idea of marketing more Hot Wheels to younger girls and so forth. Next slide. But really, when it came to Intellivision and the video games, they were known as boys' toys. Even going back to the handhelds, these were explicitly marketed to boys who were 11 to 7 or male adults, right? Hence, this is why Plimpton was chosen as one of the spokespersons for Intellivision. There was some marketing to women in some games, for example, Royal Dealer, which if you read the book, we have documents saying that this was made for the bored housewife set and so forth. So there was experiments to reach out into different demographics to reach more diverse audiences, but not extensively. Yeah, go to the next slide, I guess. In fact, one of the things that's really interesting about the marketing research when Intellivision was test marketed in 1979 in Fresno, California, their studies actually found that they had a problem with not having enough software for female users. And they recommended that you really need to develop more female-oriented software, it was said, right? So from the very inception, before Intellivision was even sold, they knew they had a problem in terms of gender. And so it's interesting from our perspective, in the book, we talk about this, that, a company that made Barbie, that was so interested in and understanding girls' play patterns to create toys for them and profit for them, would have an issue within their marketing research. So, or within developing the software for Intellivision. So in our book, we talk about the successes of Mattel's marketing and its impact on the video game history, but also its failures in that regard. Next slide. Yeah, the history of realism is also another important aspect of this. This is an advertisement, again, comparing baseball, and you can see the difference with the Intellivision version on the left, having a baseball diamond, and the Atari version on the right, which doesn't have that kind of realistic simulation. And at the bottom, the Intellivision slogan became the closest thing to the real thing. But this history also was attached to a longer history with toys. Next slide. When we were looking at the history of Mattel and toys, we realized that there were a lot of toys that were already simulating real things, like the Barbie, right? And from advertisements would even be really hyperbolic about how realistic it was. Gene Kilroy, who was one of the toy designers in the 1970s, actually made this interesting comment that said, well, you call this realism and realistic, but I call it quality. That Mattel always wanted to make, high quality level toys. And Intellivision was a Rolls Royce when it was compared to Atari, right? So it's a different way of thinking about how realism was equated with quality. Next slide. As Tom already mentioned, there was this character, the Running Man, which was really a human, right? It gets gendered in a certain way that isn't really marked in that sense. But from the very beginning, the Mattel Electronics wanted to make a football game, right? And they wanted to develop these realistic looking human avatars. And so from even 1978, the first kind of demo of what Intellivision could do had this quote unquote Running Man, who would be this athletic sports figure. And they wanted this realistic, movement that shows the different limbs moving. Next slide. So, this became extremely important for them in terms of marketing. They would talk about the realistic movement, the smooth movement, the limbs, and how you can identify the arms and the legs when compared to the blocky figures of Atari that looked really bad. I won't really talk about what's on the left because that's more about how being able to develop this realistic way of marketing in television was related to the hardware and the technology and the ability to make these appendages visible. But we can talk about that in the Q&A later. Next slide.
So one thing that we do talk about in the book as well, just very briefly, is this question of what we call affordance zones and constraint. And we talk about affordance zones because for the programmers at the time, and when we interviewed them and talked about them, these weren't always seen as constraints. They were sometimes seen as liberating. We talk about haiku, where you have a limit on syllables. It's not a constraint, it's a genre. And that this was actually liberating sometimes for folks. And there could be many forms of constraint, like when Burger Time was created for Intellivision, it had to be made horizontal, not vertical, because it was originally an arcade game. And so when Ray Kastner programmed it, down at the bottom where the burgers are being made, like the one in the middle, the lettuce has disappeared because there's just not space, right? And the affordances of 8 moving objects and all of those kinds of things were some of the affordances that we looked at in the book. But also time could be an affordance. More than 80% of sales happened at Christmas. This is a pre-internet period where things were being sold in Walmart and Sears and elsewhere. And so the January Consumer Electronics Expo was hugely important. If you didn't have a game to show there for Christmas 11 months later, you were out. You had to have it ready basically by then to get buy-in, to then be able to get it ready to produce and ship by Christmas. Licensing could also be a really interesting affordance. The early games like Major League Baseball or the football one we showed you, they had licenses with like the associations, right? Like Major League Baseball. They would only pay like $5,000 to $10,000. It was really just to sort of show that they were intelligent and realistic, because these weren't owned by the companies. I mean, by like Major League Baseball, that no one could make a baseball game. But then with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, they paid over $500,000 for the licensing rights to that. They made 3 games based on the Tron movie, which was one of the first tie-ins to a movie ever. And then also the Kool-Aid Man game we're going to mention in a second, show you how licensing and promotion could act as an affordance it just as much as computation in some ways. So Kool-Aid Man is a game where these two kids are running around inside of a house trying to make Kool-Aid, and it was done through a licensing agreement with General Mills. Kool-Aid Man at that time was more famous than Ronald McDonald. What you're seeing right now, some people think is the first sort of cut scene in video game history where Kool-Aid Man comes through there and says, "Oh yeah." But anyway, this is sort of the basics of what the game looks like. Mark Kennedy programmed the game and admits that it was not the most fun game he ever made. Some people talk about it as one of the worst designed video games ever done. He had to do it with very little time, and he had to work with these licensing affordances. And what I mean by that, and I won't go into this in detail, but actually Kool-Aid Man was also made for the Atari. It was a trans-platform game. And Jane Turgeon, who was one of the many female programmers at Mattel, there were quite a few at Mattel, was one of the main programmers for that. In order to come up with this Kool-Aid Man game, they held a brainstorming contest. And here in the archive are some examples of ideas. The one on the bottom left, as you can see, is the one that actually won the contest. But the programmers came up with some wacky ideas, like you see one here where the far right, it says Kool-Aid Man is dead. But Mark Kennedy said that General Mills actually came with a kind of 10 commandments of licensing affordances, that Kool-Aid Man couldn't die. He's always full. He never sloshes. He can't kill anyone. And the kids can't come to any harm. And these acted as affordances shaping the game design just as much as a limit of 8 moving objects. And so in that realm of game design and affordances, licensing is really worth analytical attention because in many cases, it played a crucial role in game design. And this shift to arcade games with Kool-Aid Man and elsewhere later on started to obscure Intellivision's sophistication. As we moved towards the crash, arcade games were selling the most. And if you just look at the Kool-Aid Man overlay compared to the one I showed you earlier of Space Battle, you can see how simple it is. It's really just an image in the center because it's really become a kind of, shoot 'em up video game, no longer the kind of complexity that characterized many of the early Intellivision games. And we won't go into right now, but there were these amazing technical considerations around joining objects together for the 2 running kids, using all 8 moving objects in that cutscene to actually be able to have the wall, the bricks come apart and Kool-Aid Man come through was actually quite complex to do for Intellivision at that time. And Braxton, did you want to mention this briefly?
We can talk about it later in the Q&A, and we can go to the next slide.
But yeah, this question of emulation is fascinating.
Yeah, I think that we wanted to just talk about a little bit about Kool-Aid Man because it's such an interesting game, even though it's talked about as the worst video game in history, even worse than E.T. We think it's one of the most interesting games, in fact, right? So you could actually play as these 2 children, that were marked as boy and girl, and you could switch between them and play them. But in the manual, it actually says that you can actually choose to play as the girl or choose to play as the boy, but it was really difficult to do that, right? So this was actually the only video game you could actually have a female avatar in the game, in fact, but it would take a very complex process of trying to get hit by a thirsty to separate the children and then switching between them in order to play as a girl. And so for us, it was an interesting kind of allegory for thinking about Intellivision and Mattel's relationship to gender in the production of video games. They did try to reach this demographic occasionally, but on most of the time, they spent their focus on thinking about making games for men and boys. And so, next slide. And we also thought this is an interesting game that was about race and as well, because it doesn't say anything in the manual. But when we're talking about to Mark Kennedy, who programmed the game, he actually said that the colors of the characters were chosen because his wife was Chinese at the time, and that he made the male character yellow, right? Because he was afraid of the kind of racist jokes that might be made within the other programmers if he had chosen to make the girl yellow, right? And so he talked about that the way that those kind of racial relationships and the fear of those kind of racist responses actually ended up creating the kind of color choices that he chose within the game. But we can talk more about that in the Q&A. I think we've run a little bit over time. Next slide. I think that's mostly what we wanted to pick Kool-Aid Man because we thought that it emphasized a lot of these different these aspects of Mattel and Intellivision. And I think we can just end there and go to questions. And if anybody has any further questions about Kool-Aid Man, we'd love to talk more about them with you.
Great. And yes, thanks everyone so much. And this is the QR code for the website where you can use that discount code that Lane mentioned, but also you can download the book as a free PDF. So thanks again so much. And we're happy to answer any questions.
Conway, give a vocal one. Okay. Hey there. We have got plenty of questions in the chat that provoked a lot of commentary, a lot of thoughts about Kool-Aid Man. Kool-Aid Man is all of us, maybe, at this point. But let me get into some of the questions dropped by some of our listeners. Capcom MDB kind of had two questions that were sort of related. The first, and they asked regarding targeting boys versus girls for games. I never realized, but Mattel's first handheld electronic games were definitely targeted at boys, right? Missile attack, football, race cars, things like that. Prior to these handhelds, they're asking, outside of talking dolls, to what extent was Mattel designing products with electronics targeted at girls or as family products, rather than thinking of the trend of electronics being primarily targeted toward boys? And I think an additional question attached to this that they asked was sort of how many women were involved in toy product development at Mattel? Was there a kind of gender split between the girls' toys and the boys' toys? I think just kind of opening this question up across both the types of things that were being produced based on gender and who were the people doing that work.
I think one thing that we could say is that Mattel Electronics, which was founded in 1977 with the handheld games, was founded entirely by men, right? And the demographics of that, the initial division of the company was very different than the demographic of women that were working in the toy company, where they had more women designers, more women executives, more women managers, and so forth. And this imbalance was always a part and a problem. But there were many women programmers at Mattel Electronics. We interviewed many of them, and graphic designers that get gendered in an interesting way as well. And so I wouldn't go so far to say that it was like a diverse kind of environment at Mattel Electronics. There were more kind of female programmers, at least, that were making games. And they always knew that they could have extended into the demographic of producing video games for women and girls, right? From the very beginning, their marketing teams were saying, you need to do this, you need to do this. But they never made the kind of leap, right? And so it was a huge missed opportunity. I don't think that answers the question.
And very briefly, one reason why that leap, we could talk about this for an hour, but just very briefly, one other reason why that is so interesting is the movement from the arcade into the home with video games was seen as a feminizing move, in the sense that we have lots of data about how arcades were seen as very hostile to women. And there was a real opportunity there with the home environment.
the sort of domestication of the video game, right? Yeah. Billy Bergara asks, they were really struck by kind of what they saw as a sort of historical similarity, that kind of comparison marketing and stuff that you see it in a television versus Atari, and then we later see it obviously so iconically with something like Sega versus Nintendo. And Billy was wondering about, is there a kind of material influence there, right? Is there any evidence that folks at Mattel later worked at Sega, or that Sega itself was influenced by these patterns? Do we have anything besides kind of the similarity or the stylistics that might actually suggest that there was a kind of direct relationship there?
Well, we could go to ROMchip and read an interview with Tom Kalinske. I'm not quite sure if he talks about it, but Tom Kalinske was, huge at Mattel before he went to Sega, and so Tom was there. And Tom, I think Kalinske became.
Did you just shame me about my own journal? Is that?
I don't know.
I've heard there's some good stuff in it,
It's like, oh yeah, that was an interview that Ray and Henry did, right, with Tom? Is that right? Or am I making that? I'll find the details on it. You keep talking.
I don't actually forget if Tom actually talks about the comparison advertisements in that interview, so I don't know. But I'm saying
we interviewed Tom as well.
Yeah, Kalinske was definitely knew about this and the power of it, right? And so I'm not quite sure like how much impact he had on that narrative kind of.
Yeah, it was Ken McAllister and Judd Regill who did that interview with Tom. Thank you for servicing that. I'll drop the link to that.
Just to mention, and we interviewed Tom Kalinske ourselves and talked about this, but another piece of this that we mentioned in the book is Intellivision sold about 3 million consoles over its lifetime. It was in second place behind Atari, but millions and millions of people who never purchased either an Intellivision or an Atari saw the TV ads, the magazine ads, the newspaper ads, all of this Plimpton rivalry stuff actually reached publics far beyond the people who owned Intellivision or Atari. And so the influence of it is really important in that, we show in the book a Bloom County cartoon about the rivalry, which was one of the most popular cartoons at the time. So it also definitely had a kind of broader popular culture influence.
Yeah, that's a great way of contextualizing that. Kevin Bunch is here. He wanted to say that he really enjoyed the book. The primary document sources are amazing. And then he had a question. And then he had a question. He says, I know the book is focused so heavily on Mattel's period with Intellivision and sort of skims over the INTV years. Were there any unique challenges to researching that later period compared to the Mattel era?
So very briefly, after the collapse of Mattel Electronics and the whole video game industry in 1984, Mattel sold all of the IP and remaining hardware, anything related to Intellivision, for $20 million or possibly less to Terry Valinsky and a group of investors who created a new company called INTV that for about 10 years sold Intellivisions and sold games, the majority of which were games that had been in the pipeline that then were, developed afterwards. And we talk about IMTV in the book, and we actually know more that we couldn't fit in the book. That's one possible spin-off article in the future is even more on INTV, because many of the same individuals involved earlier on were involved with INTV. So it wasn't super hard. We have a lot that we could say about INTV. Part of it was, given the size of this project, we really tried to be strict with ourselves to end with 1994. And we just briefly talk about INTV and then the whole, retro community leading up to the present day.
But it is true. We have a lot of memos and documents, from Mattel Electronics because they were saved, and INTV went to a different model of production, right? And so there were no memos.
Yeah, much, much less, because it was all done through contract work, basically.
And phone calls, yeah.
We have a few more questions. Tom, I know you have somewhere to be, so if you need to bounce, I want to give you permission.
I've still got 10 more minutes.
Okay, awesome. Matt Knutson had a question. Thanks so much for the talk. Good to see you both. The part about reverse engineering the Atari was really stimulating to hear. Reminds me of EA reverse engineering the Genesis to bring Madden there without paying licensing fees. And Matt's question is sort of, are these anecdotes kind of part of this kind of quaint console wars era, or are these things just always kind of present in games? Maybe it's sort of asking you to remark on the kind of larger role of reverse engineering, or any more details you have about how that was done with the Intellivision would also be fascinating.
Yeah, so very briefly, and Braxton can add, I mean, it was a bit of a wild west around intellectual property in those early years. And, you know, there were ripoffs of Space Invaders and Pac-Man right and left by all different companies. And sort of the lawsuit sort of came later. And that when I showed that image of the failed asteroids that became Space Hawk, that was one of the first times where they were showing it at CES, at a convention. And Atari representatives said, we're going to sue you. And they were shocked. It just had not happened before. But they reverse engineered the entire Atari system, both to make video games for it and to make the system itself. And they would, in the later years, do things like the people doing the programming had to be in almost like a closed off room, and they couldn't communicate with, you know, the Atari people. They'd have to communicate through faxes and memos so they could show that they reversed engineered it themselves, figuring it out themselves, and that would be allowed. So yeah, we have some great stories about that.
Yeah, sort of like clean room sort of stuff.
Very much.
Braxton, did you have anything to add?
I'd say it's a great question, and I like the other example that's brought up. I think we conceptualized the idea of trans-platform because we think the relationships between these different platforms are important, but we don't really know, like, if more research would be great to see if that trans-platform thing holds up, you know, like.
Camille Simulated Magic has a question. Notions of realism in graphics today are often connected to an idea of immersion, which, you know, has been interrogated a lot in like queer game studies, for instance. Camille's curious if/how that idea of immersion was a desirable thing connected to realism. I think another way of asking this is like, were those things understood as having any kind of conceptual relationship? Was that part of a language yet about what realism was supposed to do?
I would say no, that immersion just wasn't seen as something, you know, they had an early attempt at a VR goggle kind of thing that we won't go into later on. But one thing we do talk about in the book is that realism above all was graphical and visual. That was very, very important. But there were other kinds of realism that wasn't so much immersion, but for instance, that in baseball you could bunt or hit a home run, or, you know, throw and and strike someone out just like in real baseball. And so gameplay realism, that the rules actually matched that of the physical world game, was another kind of realism. And for the sports games, what was so interesting is what they tried to create was the realism of watching a game at home. So it was not the immersion of being on the play field. It was recreating watching.
It was the televisual experience of baseball.
And we talk about that televisual realism. So it was about recreating the experience of watching a baseball game on TV, of watching a soccer game on TV, where the physical instruction manuals for some of the games had to explain to you that the screen was going to pan right and left during soccer when they went from goal to goal. So people would know this was such a new thing, but that was replicating obviously a camera in a physical soccer game. So it wasn't really immersion so much as a kind of gameplay realism, but that would also even show up in checkers and chess and all kinds of things. That kind of realism, at least in some games, and that was very much linked to sports, because obviously if you're talking about Space Invaders or Pac-Man, you know, you could have fidelity to the console, but realism doesn't make sense in the same way. Sports really surfaced that kind of gameplay realism.
Yeah, so and I mean that continues into kind of the sports game genre today, is always mediated through the televisual experience of like watching football, watching basketball, right? we have to wrap this up, but I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one final question. And, you know, when I was listening to you both go through this, it just seemed to me that, like, okay, sure, the Atari came out, the VCS comes out earlier, but like Mattel had so many ecosystem advantages, right? It's more robust technology, better marketing, better research, a less dysfunctional work environment, right? You're dealing with a real proper corporation in a sense. You know, what are these reasons? I think you said that they got 20% market share, but it was never bigger than that. And that seems striking to me, right? And I'm wondering what your kind of diagnosis would be about why Mattel was not able to overtake Atari, right?
I would say just quickly, number one would just be price. You know,
Yep.
it was always $100 more. They hired engineers like Linda Bruce, I think is the name of an engineer. Her entire job was to reverse engineer the Atari in terms of cost, to figure out how they made things so cheaply and how they could save pennies on the Intellivision. So Intellivision 2 comes out, which is just Intellivision 1. It has no technological advancements, but it's cheaper, right? And so it can compete with Atari, but it's too late. The video game crash is coming. And so cost is one of the huge things. Tom?
So I would say two things. One is cost above all. And Mattel was legendary for being good at cost cutting, about cutting a tenth of a penny from the Barbie or the Hot Wheels, but keeping quality. They were legendary about it, but they really struggled. The Intellivision 2 only took 2 screws in the back instead of 4. That was a big deal. You know, anything to save money. But back in that day, $300 for an Intellivision versus like $180 to $200 for an Atari was a big price point difference for a video game, for a new thing that no one really knew what it was. Yeah. The games themselves weren't that different in price, but the console was a huge deal. You know, the hand controllers could be an issue as well. But I would say one final thing that we see with, you know, at the same time with things like VHS and Betamax is that once you get a market established share, and we see this with platforms nowadays with something like Facebook, right? That once you get a market dominant share and get that kind of lock-in situation happening, it can be very hard for others to break in. And during the years, there might have been a time when it got closer to 30%, but it was never, it was always clearly in second place. So I think cost, but also being behind, you know, once that's established, it's hard to break.
I would just add one thing. There might be a critique too of like Plimpton and the complexity and sophistication, which was always linked to this kind of like masculine intelligence and so forth. Like Atari always had games that were much more diverse in terms of its gameplay and so forth, right? So it could have been very limiting in kind of how it presented itself to the public, right? Like they had a bunch of market research about the advertisements that never scored well with like women viewers, right? Except for one where George Plimpton talks to a little boy and like it's like a motherly thing, and then there was a big reaction. So just to add that, there could be a, you know, cultural problems.
Fascinating. I'm going to let you both go. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a incredibly rich talk. There's been so much chatter in the chat. We're going to drop this on our YouTube sometime in the next couple days. Again, thank you both. Remember, the book is available open access. We'll drop that link in the chat. And also read MIT 20 for 20% off if you want the material object. Also, donate.romchip.com. I love ROMchip. You should too. And with that, thank you and game on. We'll see you next Saturday. Maybe not you two, but, you know, those in the chat. February 22nd for our 12-hour fundraiser. I'll be here all day long.
Thank you.